1 in 4 Canadians may be poor.
At how many Canadians are struggling with the rising cost of living? 1 in 4 people living in poverty in this country.
These headlines shook Canada last week, and it got my attention. For a G7 country with one of the world's biggest economies, this number is surreal. These numbers mean that Canadian would be worse off than Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Dominican Republic, to name a few. So I decided to take the same survey to see if Anna and I are living below the poverty line. And turns out we are. So how's that possible? So this is the report that we're looking at. And it starts with establishing the metric that matters. But it's not actually the metric that they end up using. More on that later. In Canada, we use MBM, the market basket measure, to determine an official poverty line. According to the MBM, poverty thresholds are based on the cost of a basket of food, clothing, shelter, transportation, and other items representing a modest, basic standard of living. The current MBM establishes thresholds for 53 different geographic regions in the provinces, which can be adjusted to different families of different sizes. When a person's or family's disposable income is below the threshold of the size of their family in a particular region, they are considered to be living in poverty. According to that metric, Canada's poverty line was around 10% in 2019. That sounds reasonable. It's definitely more reasonable than 25%. And that puts us at around the same level as Czech Republic and Mauritius. But wait a second. Does everyone in the world use the MBM? Are we comparing apples to apples here? In short, no. MBM is a metric unique to Canada. But there is a notion of a basket in other countries too, and what's included in them varies greatly on the country's economical situation. That is to say that the richer the country, the higher the bar for the poverty line. So the poverty in Canada would look very different than poverty, let's say, in North Korea or Thailand. In Canada, the MBM measures the ability of a family to purchase a basket of goods, which consists of 4 components. First, it's the nutritious food. The exact composition of that is defined by Health Canada. Then we have a clothing component. When they say that, they mean the most common work and social occasions clothing, which includes doing sports, and it also includes appropriate winter clothing. And then we have a housing component. The family should have the ability to rent a median cost 3-bedroom apartment in their community if they're a family of 4. But we do know that they adjusted based on the household size. Transportation. Public and private, depending on where you live. For instance, the minimal basket measure assumes, in some regions, the cost of car ownership and associated fees. Car ownership is a pretty massive expense in itself. Depending on the car you have, where you live and how often you drive, and the insurance you pay, it can easily be at least $1,000 monthly expense. So, in Canada, you may be considered poor, according to the MBM measure, if you don't own a 5-year-old Chevy Cavalier. The final component of the MBM measure is being able to cover other necessary expenditures. Personal care, household needs, furniture, telephone service, reading, recreation, entertainment, and school supplies. The reading, recreation, and entertainment component also includes a newspaper subscription, video rentals, YMCA memberships, magazines, books, and tickets for movies and sports events. So how can we compare Canada to the rest of the world? United Nations came up with a global multidimensional poverty index, and their index looks at many more things like access to drinking water, sanitation, electricity, child mortality. So on that index, Canada scored, well, it's actually not even in the list. This list covers 110 out of 195 countries in the world, and it starts with Niger and ends with Serbia. I guess the remaining 85 countries have it pretty good in comparison, Canada included. But wait, that's not the only way we measure poverty. There's also a Gini index, which measures income and wealth inequality. Canada's doing better than the USA and slightly better than Australia and the UK, but worse than Sweden, Norway, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. Wait, what? Yeah, this index is not really representative. This index measures inequality. So if everyone in the country is equally poor, that will lower the index too. OECD has a definition and a measure of the poverty rate. So basically, each country decides what their poverty line is currently. Canada sits at 10%, doing better than the UK, Germany, Australia, and Israel. But it's doing worse than Portugal, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. Now, let's get back to that food banks report. There is a big quote here about the food banks visits. It goes without saying that while increase in food bank visits is a data point worth looking at, it is highly inaccurate, since it's pretty easy to take advantage of a food bank, even when you don't really need it. What this report admits further is that the MBM measure is a measure of probability and not a definition. So there is a good deal of false negatives and false positives in this measure. This report acknowledges that. They say that you shouldn't only use inputs like income and cost of living in the case of MBM, but also output and what you can actually end up affording and activities you can participate in. So they came up with another metric, the material deprivation index, which this report and their conclusions are based on. The food banks assembled a team of experts to come up with this new metric. It's actually not a new metric. Europe has already been using it for decades, and the most recent number for EU is 6.7%, which is the overall population that's experienced severe material deprivation as measured by similar but not the same items as the Canadian MBM. The food banks thought that this was not good enough. They wanted to better understand the nature of poverty in Canada and explain the gap between the MBM and the food bank experience in Canada. In other words, they were not happy with what the existing MBM data was telling them and decided to come up with their own metric. Remember the good old campaign in 1937 by the tobacco company Philip Morris, claiming that smoking a certain brand of cigarettes is healthy. Anyways, that's how the new Canadian MDI was born. The authors of the report surveyed a representative sample of approximately 2,000 Canadian residents. Then, in phase 2, they surveyed 4,600. This survey included an oversample of several groups whom they thought were at particular risk of experiencing poverty. Single parents, adults between the ages of 25 and 64, and people who identify as Indigenous, Black, or South Asian. Oversample. That means that they selected more samples from a specific population or group that is statistically representative. So let's take this survey together. Let me know in the comments what your outcomes are. We're actually going to go into the appendix of the full 100-page report and get the original questions. What's curious is this survey doesn't just start with general demographic data, but also goes on to ask the respondents about the general life outlook, including how much they trust the government. And right after that, we dive into the deprivation survey. There's also a set of questions for households with children, so we will skip these. Is everyone in your household able to eat meat or fish or vegetarian equivalent at least every other day? How can one measure a vegetarian equivalent? Overall, our answer is yes, we are able to eat all the combination of the above. Is everyone in your household able to get around your community whenever they need to? For us, no. We live in the suburbs and only own one car. The commute is a pain in the butt. We definitely cannot afford additional expenses associated with a second car, parking, and extra gas. Does everyone in your household have at least one pair of properly fitting shoes and at least one pair of winter boots? Yes. Next, are you able to keep your house or apartment at a comfortable temperature all year round? No, we cannot. We live in an older home, so the insulation isn't ideal. The hot days of the summer can get pretty hot despite the AC. We did an energy assessment recently on our home, and the energy advisor recommended that we update the roof insulation, then replace the furnace, replace the AC, and the water heater. We definitely cannot afford to do that. Are you able to participate in celebrations or other occasions that are important to people from your social, ethnic, cultural, or religious group? I think so. Next, are you able to buy some small gifts for family or friends at least once a year? Yeah. Are you currently able to pay your bills on time? Yeah. Does every adult in your household have appropriate clothes to wear for special occasions, such as a job interview, wedding, or a funeral? No, we don't. We never had to attend a wedding or funeral, and I certainly cannot afford buying a dress or a suit that I would only wear once or twice in life. Is everyone in your household able to get regular dental care, including teeth cleaning and fillings, at least once a year? Yes. Take care of your teeth, folks. It becomes way too expensive if you don't. If you wanted to, could you spend a small amount of money each week on yourself? Yeah, I buy myself chocolate every week. If you had an unexpected expense today of $500, could you cover this expense from your own resources? Yes. So these are all the questions that we had. So how did we conclude that we live in a poverty, like I said in the beginning of the video? This report outlines that they debated on how they should measure all of that and what are the consequences, and what they come up with is 2 items or more. So if you answer no, I cannot afford it to at least 2 questions, you're considered to be living below the poverty line according to this survey. Interestingly, the deprivation survey methodology for Europe has only 8 individual questions and requires at least 3 no's in order to add a person to the poverty statistics. Canada, in turn, came up with 14 items and a lower poverty threshold. I'm not an economist or a scientist, but that feels slightly privileged to me. To make this clear, I'm not rejecting the notion that Canadians are experiencing higher levels of deprivation and more Canadians are now living below the poverty line. These two are facts, but it is also a fact that the headlines and conclusions like 1 in 4 Canadians live below the poverty line are derived from experimental research and may be nothing more but a clickbait statement meant to enrage and upset more people. It is also a fact that Canadian credit card debt is up. NerdWallet reports more than half of Canadian adults have credit card debt, and 50% of them think that it will take them at least 6 months to pay off that debt. And the need to pay off these debts will yield higher levels of material deprivation in other aspects. In fact, Canadians are paying the highest portion of disposable income towards debt. For every $1 of disposable income, Canadians have $1.74 of debt to pay. This isn't just because of credit card debt, but also house debt. Many Canadians are either house poor or are paying way too much for housing, rent, food, and necessities, seeing no option but to get themselves into debt. We live in the challenging economic conditions, and Canada is not alone. A recent World Bank report predicts a rise in global inequality and that most countries have experienced an increase in poverty in the last 4 years. How are the countries likely to deal with all of that? The reports outline several examples of how poverty and inequality has been dealt with historically. All countries reduce inequality through taxation, subsidies, and transfers. How exactly it's done depends on the specific country's economy and its policies. For instance, richer economies collect more revenue from direct taxes like income tax, property tax, capital gains tax. Poorer economies, in turn, rely on indirect taxes like sales tax or tax on import and export. We're not advocating for higher tax, but the most economically successful countries do. Take Finland, for example. It has some of the lowest poverty rates in OECD, yet the country ranks as the happiest country in the world. And it has the highest personal tax rates. And it has the 3rd highest capital gains tax in Europe, although they do have lower corporate tax rates. Perhaps there's a thing or two that we could borrow from the way the Finns approach this. The question is, will everyone be satisfied with that? Let me just leave you with something here. In Canada, you're considered living under the poverty line if you don't own a house or a car. And this is practically ingrained in the market basket minimum and the deprivation measure assessment. But I feel truly privileged to live in a country for which these are the biggest issues that the population faces. Thank you for watching, guys. Gently tap the like button if you found this video curious, and subscribe to this channel not to miss more videos about how to arrive, excel, and thrive in Canada. If you would like to support the work that we do to help us do more better content, you can join our YouTube channel membership for a small fee. You can find the links in the description box below, or simply tap the join button right next to our name. See you in the next one. Take care.